So we talked about this a little bit. So to remind you for where we were when we talked about Russia modernizing, Russia industrialized behind every other Western European nation and the U.S. They are behind. When industry starts moving, they don't have it in Russia. So when it does, it brings an immense social and political change because people go from being farmers to being workers, and it's a whole different life. And so between 1890 and 1910, 1890 and 1910, the population of the cities of Russia are going to more than double. They're going to more than double. And so this is going to be a huge change. Because of that, we're going to see some situations like overcrowding, destitute living. So people begin to move to the cities. The cities are not prepared to handle that many people. They begin to overpopulate the cities. And so the cities are kind of busting at the seams here. Population boom and a harsh growing season and expensive wars mean that they don't have enough food. And if you want to tick people off, you have a food shortage. This is a huge thing. And so the food shortages, the city population shifts, all of these, the costly wars, are going to lead to angry workers. They're going to lead to these angry workers. And so what you see is the rise of Bloody Sunday in 1905. Now, there are a lot of different movements that have like a Bloody Sunday day, like Civil Rights Movement has a day that's called Bloody Sunday. This is kind of one of the first Bloody Sundays, if you will. And this particular one is going to be this very large protest. It's a group of Russian workers that go against the monarchy. And what ends up taking place is they are out protesting. And I want you to notice the guy in the front. You probably don't know what these guys in the front are, but the guys in the front are Russian Orthodox ministers. Those very traditional hats, kind of like that, and the way they're attired is how the ministers of the Russian Orthodox Church would dress, okay? And so then you see over here, you see all of these armed soldiers. So you have the common people, you have the church here, and you have the soldiers back here. Hello, we just started. I showed them a real quick video that I will send to you. So, all right. And so you see with this, hundreds of unarmed protesters are going to be killed or wounded in this massacre by the Tsar's troops. So they are protesting for food. They are protesting for rights. They are protesting for all of these. But this very important event is going to be the foundation, the spark of the Russian Revolution, which will eventually make Russia a communist nation and no longer a monarchy. And so this is where it starts. This is their Boston Tea Party. You know, this is this event for them that is going to shift everything in the history. So let's talk about a little bit about Nicholas II. As the film mentioned to you, he was a young ruler, and he obtained his position when his father passed away. His father he passes away kind of quickly. And as it said in the video, he was in kidney failure. And there was actually thought that maybe he had been poisoned. Now, it said they exhumed him all these years later. I think it was, 2018, and did an autopsy. And yeah, he did die of kidney failure. However, let's just be honest. At this point, does it matter? No, because why those things are significant, I mean, it's significant, it's your family member. But otherwise, what's significant is what the people believe. And if the people are already unhappy, and they believe that he was possibly poisoned. And at that time, I mean, there were some poisons that could be detected through autopsy, but a lot that could not. And so his death couldn't be verified. And so it already adds to that feeling of disgruntlement that the people are having, and then they end up in this Bloody Sunday thing. And so the tension is just mounting. Now, Nicholas is going to marry a German woman. the Russians and the Germans have had a lot of conflict with each other. And as it said, their relationship is very unusual. Do you remember why I said it was unusual?
No.
They liked each other. They actually married for love. Nicholas and Alexandria are a rare couple of royalty at this time in the fact that the two were very smitten. In fact, they write all of these love letters to each other when he's on the front. I believe most of them were published. Like, they had this very passionate love for each other, which is very atypical for European rulers at that time. And of course, they were also related because, you married cousins and all that kind of fun stuff. In fact, he was discouraged from marrying her by his father because they knew she was a carrier of hemophilia. Now, the thing that's interesting, though, however, is despite the fact she was a carrier, they have all of these children together, and the hemophilia does not pop up until the very last child. And this is Nicholas, and I love the young pictures of him. I thought when he was young, he was very handsome, and even he ages well. And so he is well recognized, and he comes into this position really ill-equipped because, as it said, his dad has protected him. And I get that. I can't imagine being in a very controversial political position. And, I get especially like how presidents and things want to protect their children. However, being president and protecting your children to me is a little different than being the czar and protecting your kids. Why?
Because it's hereditary. You pass on the crown to the next person.
Absolutely. Because one day it's going to be his problem. And, we all assume that we're going to live a long and healthy life. Or even if we have health issues, we kind of have an assumption, well, I should live to here or live to there. But by not helping Nicholas be aware of what was going on, his dad, in a lot of ways, kind of throws Nicholas to the wolves when he dies. Not his intention, but he does because he had tried to protect him. And Nicholas really didn't understand what he was getting into. So after the blood, and it reminds me, the fall of the Romanovs reminds me so much of really the fall in the French Revolution of Louis and Marie, and how they were kind of oblivious to what what was going on, because they had been protected as well. And like why Marie makes her famous, let him eat cake comment. It was that she was ignorant to the starvations and it was a different era. And so let's talk about what's going to happen with Nicholas. So Nicholas II, after this bloodshed in 1905, he's kind of like, oh, I guess people are unhappy. So he tries to patch it. And so he forms a series of representative assemblies. Representative assemblies called Dumas. D-U-M-A-S.
Is this the son or the dad?
This is Nicholas II. I'm sorry, I should be specific. We've killed off Dad. Dad's gone. Yeah, this is Junior. And the reason Nicholas does this is he says, okay, well, we'll work towards reform. If reform's what's needed, we'll work towards reform. So Russia is going to enter World War I in 1914 in support of Serbia, right? Because Serbia is their big friend. They're also going to be joined by Britain and France, which we talked about the other day, and you probably knew before you even came in here. Now, the involvement proved disastrous for the Russian Empire because militarily, and we talked about this a little bit on Monday, Russia's behind. You've heard people talk about before, bringing a knife to a gunfight. It basically means you are not up to date on your technology, right? And this is kind of where Russia is. They are very behind. Their tactics and their equipment, they are no match for Germany. And their casualties are higher than any other nation in any previous war. More Russians died in this war. And they don't last the whole time, right?
Than any other war?
Than any other nation in any other war. I want to say it was like, I don't have it here, but I think it was 10 or 11 million. That's pretty high. let's see. While we're at it, and I may be thinking of deaths too, but. Now, again, World War II is going to make World War I look like fun. So, yeah. So the total number of people who died, if you look at their population, was 164 million. The total number of people who died was between 2.3 to 2.7. That's not the other casualties. I think we're close to 10. But look at the death toll here that just kind of made an impression on me. Serbia. 1 out of 6 Serbians died in the war. It's kind of huge. But anyway, I digress. That's not casualties. That's fatalities. Killed or died. There we go. Okay, but how many casualties? Anyway, imagine that the internet doesn't have. But yeah, I want to say it's. I have a chart in my U.S. World War I thing, and I think it was like over 10 million Russian casualties as far as people who were wounded or killed. And once again, the next war is going to make that look like funsies. So Nicholas takes his guys. They go, they fight, they are outdated. Now, what they very quickly found is they were behind. The problem is, while this same thing is going on, Russia has food and fuel shortages. Food and fuel shortages back home. And so if you are feeding soldiers overseas, you have a bigger shortage because you're trying to make all of these. So, yeah. So it's a lot. All right. So moving from there, let's see. The economy was hopeless and disrupted by the costly war effort, and Tsar Nicholas left the Russian capital of St. Petersburg in 1915 to command the Russian army. And so things aren't going well, but again, it doesn't feel good when the Tsar's not there. It's kind of like what we talked about with Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. When he's not there, it causes problems in America, and it is the same thing here. So if we are discussing what is leading to the problems, of course, we have to address something that it also mentioned in the film, and this is Alexandria and Rasputin. So this is the Tsarina, Queen Alexandria, and this is Rasputin, and this is a colorized photo of Alexei. I really liked the colorized photo. I just thought it was nice. But at any rate, so here's what happens. We said that Alexei is a hemophiliac, and so because of this, his health is very fragile, and so his mom becomes very attached to this guy who is supposed to be a healer. Now, he uses his power and manipulation to influence her. And there were a lot of rumors that circulated Russia, although there seems to be absolutely no evidence. For one thing, she would have considered him, although she considered him a faith healer, she also considered him kind of lower class. And I don't think this would have been the case. I always want him to shower, like he looks greasy to me. But there were rumors that they were romantically involved, but there's like not any evidence, and the rumors don't seem to stem from any of the palace people. But he was known for being very promiscuous as a faith healer who was supposedly this Russian Orthodox religious man. He was very promiscuous at his time that he is in the Russian capital. He always stayed around the Russian capital because Alexandria wanted him close in case Alexei got sick. Since the time he came in the room, he got better. So it becomes very interesting. So finally, some members of the Romanov family, and this is there's a really good documentary on Rasputin as well. Some of it probably is a little inappropriate for school because it's a little much, but these members of the family decide to take him out. And so there's like a cousin of theirs, and he invites Rasputin over for dinner.
Romanov family? They decided.
Yes, a cousin of theirs decides to get rid of Rasputin. And so he invites him to his house. He had this 2-story house. And Rasputin was down, if I remember correctly, or he was upstairs. That's where he was. He invited him upstairs to his sitting room, and they fed him these little cakes, like you would think about like tea time type cakes. And they were covered like with powdery type sugary substance. And he laced them with cyanide. Now, cyanide is poison. They were so laced with cyanide, he ate enough to kill about 20 people. And he doesn't die. He doesn't even look sick.
I read something that says like they put the cyanide and then baked it, and that kind of
It
left
kind
the
of
effect.
muted it, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I read. That's probably how he survived. That the effects were probably muted.
Yeah. And so the cousin like gets kind of freaked out. And so he has this other friend who is in the house that he keeps like leaving the room to go speak to him. And he's like, he's not dead. He's not dead. He keeps eating him and he's not dead. And he had this big, healthy appetite anyway. Rasputin, the image doesn't show it clearly, but he's a very tall man. So he's a big guy. And so, do what?
It said like a Russian.
Yes, like a Russian. And so he is there, and so he keeps going out, and the cousin keeps going out. And he's like, he's not dead, he's not dead. And the other guy's like, well, just shoot it. And so he goes in, and he shoots it, and he runs out. And he goes and he tells the other guy, I shot him. And he's like, is he dead? And he's like, I think so. And so he goes back in. You know, the guy has had enough poison to kill 20 people. And he has been shot. And so he goes, and he's kind of bent over. And I mean, like, you couldn't ask for a better movie script. And he kind of goes to tap him, and Rasputin opens his eyes, and he says to him in Russian, basically, you've been a bad boy. And the guy, like, takes off running because he's scared to death. Because, I mean, first of all, it's Rasputin, and he's big, and he's kind of creepy, and his eyes are kind of creepy. I mean, do you see the creepy eyes? Like, they're kind of creepy to me. And so he comes, and so then Rasputin goes running out and running down the stairs. And so the friend and the cousin are like, well, we can't let him leave. So they're like chasing him out. And the whole time he is screaming in Russian, I'm going to tell the Tsarina, which literally translates to, I'm going to tell mommy, which I think is kind of great. So he's like, I'm telling mom, you know, and he's running out. And so they start to just unload on him. They both are shooting at him. He's shot several times and he falls down. And so then they're both scared. And so they don't like want to leave his body like sitting on the, you know, the front porch here. And so I think he actually made it like right to the gate. So there's dead Rasputin, or so they think. And so they take him and they weigh him down. They tie him under some wood. They believe that he's dead. They check him, he's dead. And so they throw him in the river. A few days later, this floats up. And Rasputin was not dead. He was dead by then, but he had water. They eventually determined he died by drowning. So all of that shooting, all of that poison, they did not kill him. But he had splinters in his nails and under his fingernails, and he had water in his lungs. And so in the autopsy, they said, yeah, he died from drowning. And so, I mean, you talk about the guy who would not die. I mean, like, come on. And so long story short, after Rasputin dies, Alexandria she's very scared because Rasputin had told her once that if he ever left the capital city or something happened to him, that Alexei would not make it. And so she had so much faith in him, and now he's dead. And so now she feels like, you know, she wonders if her son will ever survive. So he is eventually murdered. He dies on December 30th, 1916. That is Rasputin's death date. November 30th, 1916. Now, despite the fact, to be fair, that most Russians had distrusted the Tsar, there was probably some thought, well, maybe with Rasputin dying, we can move on, because people hated him. Like, it was just weird to them that this random, like, weird guy, and he would do some weird and creepy things around Russia, like, that were very public. It wasn't uncommon for him to, like, stand up half naked in a restaurant and scream, I'm the one who runs Russia. So, yeah, he's a little bit off, to say the least. And so there was kind of this hope by the relatives of the Romanovs that by getting rid of him, that maybe, you know, people would forget the crazy, right? They could kind of go back to normal and stay in power. And so that is not going to be the case. So things are going to escalate. And so the Russian economy is going to go backward. And Nicholas is going to choose to dissolve the Duma. Now, it's kind of interesting because Nicholas made the Duma because the idea was to give the people more voice, dissolves the Dumas. Remember the local little leaderships? And so he made them so that he could be more in touch with the people. And then all of a sudden he's like, yeah, forget that. Y'all are all gone. And so he gets rid of them. All right. Moderates, of course, you always have radicals that are about overthrowing, but moderates begin to join the movement. And they begin to call for an overthrowing of this unconcerned and hapless czar who did not care about them. Call for a change in the government. So when does it get out of hand? Well, the February Revolution. The February Revolution. The February Revolution is going to begin, ironically, March 8th, 1917. Yes, they used the Julian calendar, which on their calendar would have been February 23rd, 1917.
When did it begin?
March 8th, 1917. There are starving people in Russia, and they take to the streets of Petrograd. The industrial workers are going to support them, and the protesters are going to end up clashing with the police when they refuse to leave. On March 11th, 3 days later, the Petrograd Army garrison are called to put the rebellion, the uprising, down.
What?
March the 11th, the army, which would have been like this particular group would be like their National Guard, if you will, the Home Guard. They're called to put the rebellion down. Some of them are going to open fire. And they kill demonstrators. Usually when that happens, protesters kind of run, but that's not what happened. The protesters keep to the streets and continue to fight, and the troops begin to waver. Petrograd. It is Petro grad. It's like petro, like gasoline. And this eventually becomes known as the February Revolution. You can see where famous statues and things were dismantled. This is actually a statue that is honoring Nicholas. It showed Nicholas with a crown on it, and you can tell where it's been torn down, and these kids are posing by it. So the Duma, which had been done away with, is going to form a new provincial government on March 12th. Form a new government. A few days later, yes, Nicholas catches wind of this. He knows the people are out of control. He reads the temperature in the room for the first time correctly, and he abdicates his throne. He basically is like, look, I'm not going to fix this. Y'all don't want me. I quit. So he abdicates. This is going to end centuries of rule in Russia by the Romanov family. Now, there were several leaders of this new provincial government that is going to be formed. One of the most famous leaders is a guy named Alexander Kerensky. So he is going to be one of the best known.
And what is he?
He is one of the leaders of this new government. It's called a provincial government, which means it's just kind of come to its position because there was nobody else there, and they are currently ruling the country. Kind of like in the American Revolution, how the I can't think of the group of the founding fathers that met at Philadelphia. It just slipped my mind. Anyway, the group that meets there that's going to be headed by Washington, I'll hit you in just a second. That is going to be your kind of the early leaders of America. They were a provincial government. Nobody had appointed them. They've taken it upon themselves Continental Congress. There we go. I was like, why did I lose that?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, but
like-
I was
it's-
like, you'll get there.
Well, thank you for having faith in me, Adriana. I was beginning to worry. I was like, what happened? Yeah, your Continental Congress leaders. So the Tsar of Russia, he abdicates and the army revolts and now joins the people. So the army has come home from World War I. They are done. This is a modernized colored version of a photo of Alexander Kerensky. So this is what he looked like. And so he establishes, he and the government, they established a liberal program of rights. It included things like freedom of speech, equality before the law, the right of unions to organize and strike,
Freedom of speech and what?
equality before the law. So that means that, like, no matter what social class you're in, you should be treated the same before the law. And then the rights of unions to unionize. So he's kind of working all of these things out that they have been looking for. Ironically, the Dumas opposed violent social revolution. I kind of find that funny because it's definitely going to go violent, right? But they do oppose that. Why? Because now that they're in control, they're like, no need to be violent, don't kill us. So they opposed violent revolution. Kerensky continued the Russian war effort, even though World War I was unpopular. And eventually, he is going to be forced to bring the Russians home. And as we said, they will drop out of the war. So let's talk specifically about the Bolshevik Revolution. So that was March. Flash forward almost exactly 7 months to November. November 6th and 7th in 1917. Now, if we were on the Julian calendar, which is where it was February for the February Revolution, this would actually be October 24th and 25th. Thus, it is called the October Revolution, which happens in November. So there you go. So a group of leftist revolutionaries are going to lead this Bolshevik party. Now, if you learned one thing in APUSH, you learned that Bolshevism, or in U.S. history, is another word for what? Yes, you should always associate it with the ABCs, the anarchists, the Bolsheviks, the communists, and socialists. They all go together in the minds of most people. And so this Bolshevik revolution is really a communist revolution. It is going to be led by none other than Lenin. It is led by Lenin, this October Revolution. He launches a nearly bloodless coup d'etat against the Duma.
And nearly bloodless.
Nearly bloodless coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is an overthrow of the government. If you want to spell it, it is coup, C-O-U-P. Let me write it out. It's a French term. It's called a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is when you overthrow who is in power. Now, Lenin doesn't want the Dumas to be in control, right? That's not what he's calling for. He doesn't like these new Dumas because they had been assembled by leaders from Russia's new bourgeoisie capitalists.
They were assembled by.
They were made up of capitalists. And he's not about capitalism. That's not his thing. So Lenin calls for a what kind of government? Well, maybe Bolsheviks, communist, socialists, yeah. He calls for a government that is ruled directly by soldiers, peasants, and workers. He does not want the elites to be in control. He calls for a government led by soldiers, peasants, and workers. And so very quickly, Bolshevik allies are going to occupy government buildings and other important locations in Petrograd.
What? He did what?
He and his people are going to occupy government buildings and other strategic locations in Petrograd. They will soon form a new government with Lenin as its head. We're having a historical experience in Miss Green's room. Hey. Will do. Thank you. All right, Mr. Watson. Signing off. Lenin is going to become the first dictator or leader of the world's first communist nation.
First dictator of.
The world's first communist nation. Now, we know that civil war broke out in Russia in late 1917 after the Bolshevik revolutions. And there are going to be warring factions between the Red Army and the White Army. Now, every time I hear this, it makes me think of like Alice in Wonderland. You know, and how you had the Red Army and the White Army and stuff. Anyway, the Red Army is going to fight for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The White Army is a loosely allied force, which kind of tells you already they're not going to do so hot. That included people who were monarchists. In other words, they wanted the king back in control, the czar.
So they fight for the crown.
Yes. Also, some of them were capitalists. They wanted the Dumas back in control. And some were more democratic socialists. It is during this time, on July 16th, 1918, that the Romanov family is going to be executed. A few months before, they had been taken. Well, they were taken from the palace, and they were put in this one home that was a very nice home. Stayed there for a little while. It's kind of a home in the country. They were allowed a lot of freedom. After being there for a couple of months, they were moved to another home, which is going to kind of be their final destination. And there, they were treated much more stricter. And it was during that time that it talked about that the women sewed all of the jewels they had inside their garments, because they thought that way, if they ever got the chance, they would try to sneak out. Basically, they were trying to figure out, that's what they think they thought, is that they would try to leave as a family, or maybe they were just trying to keep some of the soldiers from stealing their jewels. But at any rate, like when they shoot them, as it said in the film, it was extremely bloody. It was horrible because, as you can see here, you have Alexandria in the back, you have Nicholas, you have their 4 daughters, and then Alexei, the baby. And when they would shoot the girls, when they go to execute them, they don't die because they keep shooting them around the bodice of their dresses to shoot them in their heart, and it's full of these jewels, and so it deflects it. And so then eventually they do take the bayonets and they kind of just like bludgeon them to death and stab them to death. It was very brutal. They took their bodies out, they cut them up, and they buried them kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And as it said, it wasn't even identified until semi-recently. It was in the early 2000s, late 90s, when a lot of this information was made public. And because it hadn't been made public because of kind of the old Russian regime, that was why Anastasia, that it showed earlier, was able to kind of rise up and say she was a descendant of the Romanovs, was because nobody really knew what had happened to them for sure. So there are all these stories about Anastasia's sightings and different things. And so anyway, but they were executed by the Bolsheviks. Mainly, Lenin did not want if the White Army started winning, he didn't want them to be able to get to them and kind of bring the emperor back. And because, you know, not everybody liked the emperor, but they didn't necessarily want him dead. And so he feels like if he comes back, he might like reunify the people. And if he's dead men can't talk. And so they get rid of them. And it was pretty brutal. All right. So the Russian Civil War ends in 1923. Lenin's Red Army claimed victory.
Wait, when did it end?
1923. And they are going to officially establish the Soviet Union. Now, a couple of things about the impact of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is going to pave the way for communism as an influential political belief system. It's going to set the stage for the rise of the USSR as a world power that will eventually go head-to-head with the United States during the Cold War. Now, one kind of cool story about the Romanov family. How many of you have ever heard of the Fabergé eggs? Anybody? Okay, so the family had this obsession with these eggs made by a family called Fabergé. They were a group of jewelers, I guess. Jewelers, there we go. And so they made all of these different Easter egg style eggs that were extremely valuable. And for years, nobody knew what happened to them. Well, in 2010, there was an American scrap metal dealer who was visiting an antique stall somewhere in the United States, and he purchased a gold egg sitting on a three-legged stand. And the egg was adorned. Once he got inside of it, he found out that the sapphires and the diamonds that were inside of it were legitimately sapphires and diamonds. And so he opens it up to reveal a clock. And so he purchases that thinking that it's nice. And so anyway, it's kind of a cool story. This shows you like some of what the eggs look like. I mean, this is an actual egg that commemorates the coronation. But anyway, this is the one the jeweler buys. And so he thinks he can resell it. And at any rate, if I remember correctly, he sells it for multiple millions of dollars. This is another one of the eggs. It has like a little chicken inside of it. This is the one here, the coronation egg. It is in the Museum of Paris, in Paris. This one is probably one of the most, look at this. I mean, these are ridiculously just ornate. So let's see if that's, yeah, here's some more of them. This one has like pictures of the family. And there are still several that have never been found. So anyway, I thought it was kind of a cool story. And so that way, if you ever hear about the Fabergé eggs, that you will know why they were so well known. But that is the end of our story about the Russian Revolution. As I told you, I can really get involved in the story of the Romanovs because I think the family history there is so interesting. So let's move on and let's talk about the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution began as a middle-class protest. Middle-class protest. It was against this guy, Porfirio Diaz. It was against Porfirio Diaz. Now, Diaz is going to come to power through a coup, much like Lenin did. His story is kind of interesting. And at first, they seem to like him because he established a stable political system by bypassing Congress in 1857. He established a stable political system and bypassed Congress and the Constitution of 1857. He actually does, well, let me stick on my track here. He bypassed Congress and the Constitution of 1857. At this time, local political bosses, kind of like Boss Tweed, are going to control elections, and powerful families monopolized the economy of Mexico. So you have these political machines that control elections. You have powerful families that control the economy. Now, while the whole system is fueled by the increase in foreign trade and investment, they are starting to build things like extensive railways, mines, and crops. Mexico is becoming very advanced technologically. The cities have paved streets. They have electric lights. They have trains, and they have drains, which means they have, water systems to clear the water out of the streets. So in 1910, this dictator, Porfirio Diaz, is going to host the world's representatives on the 100th anniversary of Mexico's independence. The 100th anniversary of the independence of Mexico from Spain. However, 6 months later, Diaz is going to be overthrown, and Mexico is going to enter into a decade of civil strife. So it's kind of ironic that you have this 100th anniversary, and then just a few months down the road, everything's falling apart. So let's talk about how that happened. There are two groups that are going to join together for the purpose of getting rid of Diaz. The first group is it's a middle-class group. It's made up of teachers, lawyers, clerks, small businessmen, merchants. These are your middle-class people. And many of these had profited from the economic improvement, but they did not like the political dominance of the wealthy and the fact that Porfirio was a dictator. So they're not real happy about that. They didn't like how the wealthy controlled the economy, and they didn't like how Porfirio himself was the dictator. This group also was afraid. They were afraid that if Diaz died without forming a representative government, that someone else would come in and that they would stay under dictatorship. Now, this is Francisco Madero. Madero is going to be a northern landowner businessman, and he campaigns in 1909 and 1910 to uphold that Constitution. He really gets
What was the date?
09 to 10. He really is going to be given a lot of support by the media.
And that's my thing.
Yes. For instance, he goes on these like mass meeting tours where he goes and speaks at all of these places, kind of like how was very typical in the United States at this time. Basically, he seeks to like model after that because it works there. And so he tries to do that, but what he finds when he goes to these different places is there are a lot of people who are not happy with him. And so he is going to manage to displace Diaz, Madero is, and convinces Diaz to hold this election. And Diaz is going to basically cheat with the election, and he wins. So Madero has lost. Diaz has won, not legally, but it's happened. And so what Diaz expects is that the loser will pack his bags and go home, right? I mean, that's typically when an election is over, you expect the election to come to an end, and the person who is successful, they take their position, and the person who loses, they go back on with their life. But that is not going to be the case here. So instead, Madero sits down, and I kind of love this, with his wife, Sarah Perez. And they're talking about maybe an armed revolt. But at first they think it's too dangerous because there's some things about Madero that I think are very significant. He was small, he was quirky, he was mild-mannered. He's not the guy who leads a revolt. It's not his personality. And so Sarah's like, I just don't think that's you. But Madero believed that the people could do it for him. And so on November 20th, 1910, Madero asked the Mexican people to rise up and to fight against Diaz. And so first he has the support of that middle class group that we talked about. And then you have the second group that's going to back him. The middle class group was your more educated. Sorry. I have this extremely zealous young lady who apparently really wants to take my class. So we'll see how that works out. All right. So this appeal struck a chord with a second group. So this illiterate rural mass, these just everyday Joes who are tired. You know, first of all, they're uneducated.
Okay, so what are they called?
Just your illiterate masses of people. And I think a lot of times when we say terms like illiterate, it sounds like we're being insulting. However, if someone is undereducated, it means that you're easier to what? As a general rule, easier to manipulate. And so people can tell you things if you don't understand how things work, and they can easily manipulate you. It's funny, we know some individuals who are, I consider to be very smart, but especially, elderly people who struggle with technology. they can be very easily manipulated. And so anytime it is something that you are undereducated with, it becomes very easy to be deceived. And so he strikes a chord with these people. Many of them, as I said, are illiterate. You have some that are Indians, mestizos. If you don't recall, the mestizos are the mix between the local native population and the Spaniards who had came to Mexico. And so you have many people here, and they're going to form the bulk of Mexico's population. And while the economy was growing, the rural areas where they lived had paid the taxes to take care of all that modernization that, quite frankly, they didn't benefit from. So a lot of them are becoming very frustrated. And so their wages are going to be low, and so they're destitute, and they decide that they're ready for change. So in that winter of 1910 to 1911, local armed bands are going to rise up in guerrilla warfare. Local armies rise up in guerrilla warfare, and Diaz can't put them down. 6 months later, Diaz's advisors told him, you better resign. And it wasn't long after that Madero became the president in the freest election the country had ever known. So they literally held an election, and Madero is elected. The years following this for Madero are very violent and chaotic. You see, Madero's experiment in a lot of ways failed. Everything he tried to get passed, probably not an expectation, probably not a surprise here, is going to fail because the old regime really doesn't want to work with him because they don't like the way he came to power. The popular elements which brought him to power
Every law he tries to pass.
was blocked. And so therefore, when he's made promises to the people and he is forming this representative government, and this representative government will not support him on trying to pass those promises, the people begin to view him as a liar. Now, most of you are probably very, very well aware that presidents in democracies can only do so much, right? I mean, Congress has got to work with you to accomplish things, and they are not playing ball with him. And so eventually, the same elements that brought Madero to power are going to overthrow him and throw him in prison. He is going to be put in prison in 1913, where he is going to be assassinated. So this ends quickly and it ends badly, which leads to the formation of a new government in Mexico. There's Madero as president. And this new government is under Victoriano Huerta. And he established a military regime. And so his military regime only made things worse because he was pretty hated. In about 18 months of fierce fighting, it culminated in him being removed from office. Did not go so well, right? So let's follow him up with Emiliano Zapata. Now, for a short time, power shifts to some popular leaders. The most famous of these, we're going to talk about a couple of them. The first is Emiliano Zapata. Zapata led villagers to recover land that had been lost to sugar estates. Zapata himself thought of himself as a man of the people. He saw himself as fiercely loyal to his followers and seeing his followers as fiercely loyal to him. And so his followers, despite their inadequate weapons and such, they're going to dominate. They're going to dominate for years. They beat better armies, but eventually things are not going to work out for him. His troops will actually occupy Mexico City. in late 1914. Now, let's switch from there and talk about the other popular leader at the time who was fighting for the same thing. Outside of Mexico City in 1914, Zapata and Villa are going to meet for the first time. Villa had become a devoted follower of Madero, and Villa had changed his way of living to where he robbed the rich and tried to right wrongs on a grand scale. In fact, he had a knack for guerrilla warfare.
And right wrong.
He would try to right the wrongs like on a big scale to make it like he massively goes after these people. If you're,
Like Robin.
yes, very much a Robin Hood thing. And so he feels like the United States is not involved correctly, so he starts attacking Texas and robbing from the people on the Texas border. He was really good with guerrilla warfare, in all truth. And so he would run like unpopular landlords and bosses. He would run them out of the country and distribute their money to his friends and followers. He handed out food to the poor, and he established free education. So very much kind of a Robin Hood thing here, right? Which is why, if you remember in U.S. history, he is so hard to catch. It's because the people kind of love him. He's a hero. So Villa's army, his guerrilla warfare army that this man had put together, just to tell you exactly how big it was, they had artillery. They had a hospital train, like a train that they would send troops to the hospitals after battles.
Had a hospital.
Mm-hmm. They had a commissary. How many of you know what a commissary is?
My mom used to work at it actually in high school. It's like where all the military people come in and they shop for things at a lower price, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, she was a cashier.
Yeah, so he had a stockpile of military equipment where his guys could go and buy their stuff. He has like a store, you know, like Poncho Villa's store. Do I hear? Yes, they do. Yeah. It's basically just like, yeah, I didn't think about those, but yeah, it's basically just like a store of supplies. So he even had supplies, like you could go get your supplies to join his army, you know? Kind of interesting. On top of that, he never lost his touch with the common people, and so they never lost their touch with him. Like they viewed him as one of them. Anybody who hands out food, if you feed me, I'll be your friend, right? You know, it's just kind of how it works. Popular movements gradually lost, though, their importance because eventually these people who were traveling and fighting with them, they kind of have to go back to real life at some point, right? I mean, it just doesn't work. By a strange irony, none of the original people who are fighting in the Civil War actually end up being the ones who are successful in it. And so it is this long process that it takes for Mexico to kind of get their government together. In the end, the constitutionalists were actually able to take over. And you have the final leader in Mexico, and I should have his picture, is Alvaro Obregón. Alvaro Obregón. And so in 1915, he finally defeats Pancho Villa. Interestingly enough, I chose this picture deliberately because you can't tell, he is missing his right arm. He lost his right arm while battling Pancho Villa, so he kind of has like this war scar thing, you know, going for him. Villa himself returned to kind of semi-bandit status in the city of Chihuahua. He would raid towns and villages, but he never got the local support that he once had in defying both the Mexican and the American army. Zapata is going to continue guerrilla warfare as well, but eventually he is going to be lured into a trap where he is going to be killed. The qualities which made Villa and Zapata and others like them revolutionaries and guerrilla fighters are really going to keep them from having political careers where they might have been successful. Basically, they were too low class for most people to accept them as leaders. They were poorly educated. They were stuck with tradition and not willing to change, and they were viewed as being from rural areas. And unfortunately, with this, They were thought to be out of touch. But what we do see by all of this is Mexico goes from being under an absolute dictator to under a constitutional government. And it becomes much more successful because of that in the long run. And those are our 2 revolutions for today. All right, so let's see how many